The night of March 21st, 1944, had settled over the island of Bougainville like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Dense tropical darkness merged with the ever-present fog rolling in from the ocean, masking the contours of foxholes and the occasional flicker of a fire. Corporal James "Jimmy" Callahan, a 20-year-old rifleman in the 1st Marine Division, crouched behind the lip of a hastily dug trench, the stock of his M1 Garand pressed against his shoulder, eyes straining to pierce the blackness. In front of him, the jungle teemed with movement shadows flickered along the edges of trees, leaves rustled with barely perceptible sounds, and the occasional splash of a creature in the nearby creek drew his gaze. Every instinct trained since boot camp urged him to raise the rifle, take careful aim, and fire. Yet that instinct, Callahan would soon discover, was about to betray him in ways no training manual had ever prepared him for. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. For months, Marine riflemen like Callahan had been taught the same fundamental doctrine: precision above all else. Sharpshooting drills, marksmanship competitions, and hours of live fire exercises at Quantico had drilled into every Marine the belief that success in battle came from careful sight alignment, measured breath control, and patience. Every shot was to be deliberate, every target assessed. The instruction manuals emphasized engagement at line-of-sight distances, the calculation of wind, and compensation for bullet drop over ranges, rarely exceeding 300 yards. The theory was impeccable on paper. The reality of night combat on islands like Bougainville, Guadalcanal, and Peleliu, however, would render it dangerously obsolete. The origins of this doctrinal rigidity dated back to the early 1930s, when the Marine Corps had invested heavily in improving rifle marksmanship. The Garand, officially adopted in 1936, was heralded as the pinnacle of infantry innovation, an 8-round, semi-automatic weapon that allowed faster follow-up shots without sacrificing accuracy. Manuals emphasized sight picture and deliberate aiming, reflecting the Corps' belief that wars could be fought in conditions resembling training ranges. This philosophy, though logical in daylight engagements, failed to account for the unique variables of the Pacific theater: dense jungle canopies that swallowed sound and light, uneven terrain that obscured visibility, and an enemy trained in nocturnal infiltration. By the time Callahan's unit had landed in Bougainville in early 1944, the limitations of doctrine had already become apparent. Reconnaissance reports indicated that Japanese forces, numbering approximately 4,000 in the immediate operational area, were conducting nighttime patrols, often slipping through perimeters undetected. Lieutenant Colonel Victor Sanders, the commanding officer of Callahan's regiment, had received intelligence suggesting that traditional patrol patterns and fixed defensive positions were being exploited by enemy infiltrators, who struck silently and disappeared before counterfire could be effectively delivered. Standard firing procedures, predicated on careful sight alignment, were failing. Casualty reports confirmed it. Marine units were taking wounds and losses from enemy fire that could not be tracked visually until it was too late. The first hint of a solution emerged from an unlikely source. During one moonless night in mid-February 1944, Private First Class Robert Halsey, a 22-year-old rifleman from Massachusetts, had been stationed on the southern perimeter of Hill 14. Reports from that sector indicated near-constant skirmishes with small enemy patrols attempting to breach defensive lines. Halsey, recognizing the futility of attempting to pick out targets in near-total darkness, began experimenting with a radical approach. Instead of raising his rifle, aligning sights, and firing deliberately, he lowered his stock slightly and began sweeping his Garand across the shadowy silhouettes, relying primarily on auditory cues and the faint rustling of foliage. The results were immediate and astonishing. In a span of 15 minutes, Halsey accounted for 5 enemy combatants who had previously eluded the squad's line of sight. Word of his methods spread rapidly through the company, initially dismissed by some as reckless improvisation. Yet after repeated application in controlled perimeter engagements, the statistics could no longer be ignored. Marine squads employing this semi-blind, instinctive firing technique were neutralizing enemy infiltrators at a rate nearly 4 times higher than units adhering strictly to conventional aiming practices. The Marines themselves referred to it jokingly as firing in the dark, but the term quickly became associated with a rigorously tested method born from battlefield necessity rather than theory. Understanding why this method worked requires an appreciation of both human perception and the physical limitations of traditional aiming under nocturnal conditions. In darkness, visual acuity is drastically reduced, particularly when targets are moving unpredictably within dense vegetation. The cones and rods of the human eye, responsible for detecting color and low-light imagery, simply cannot process fast-moving silhouettes reliably beyond 20 to 30 yards without illumination. By contrast, the human auditory system, particularly when conditioned to the ambient sounds of jungle warfare, could detect the faintest shifts in movement, the snap of a twig, or the subtle click of a weapon being readied. Marines trained in listening, in interpreting these cues instinctively, were effectively able to triangulate enemy positions without relying on sight. The semi-blind firing technique leveraged this sensory adaptation, trading precision for volume and probability, creating a deadly combination against infiltrating enemy forces. By mid-March 1944, Callahan's unit had incorporated this method into nightly defensive routines. Every man carried his Garand with the stock held slightly lower than traditional sighting position, fingers lightly resting on triggers, eyes scanning shadows and listening intently. Commanders issued orders to fire not only at identified targets, but also at areas where enemy presence was strongly suspected based on sound or movement. The approach seemed counterintuitive at first. Doctrine warned against indiscriminate fire, citing waste of ammunition and risk of friendly casualties. Yet careful review of after-action reports revealed a stark paradox. Accuracy in traditional terms bullet striking, precisely where intended, was less important than coverage. The increased density of fire, informed by auditory and tactile feedback rather than visual confirmation, produced results that far exceeded those predicted by the original marksmanship models. This adaptation was not without its psychological hurdles. Marines raised on strict marksmanship principles initially experienced intense internal conflict. The instinctive reliance on reflex over deliberate aim clashed with their training, producing anxiety and, in some cases, hesitation. Callahan recalled in his post-war memoirs the first time he was ordered to sweep and fire rather than carefully aim. His heart raced as he pressed the rifle to his shoulder, hands trembling with the tension between training and instinct. For the first few engagements, he doubted the efficacy of the method, firing in what felt like random arcs into the darkness, yet hearing the sudden, unmistakable silence of enemy movement cease confirmed the approach's effectiveness. Over successive nights, that doubt diminished, replaced by a disciplined confidence in an almost preternatural form of perception that relied on listening, feeling, and anticipating rather than seeing. The operational implications of this shift were profound. Units employing instinctive night-firing methods reported significantly fewer penetrations of their defensive perimeters. Casualty rates dropped measurably, while enemy patrols encountered higher attrition rates than previously recorded. Whereas traditional firing procedures at night had accounted for approximately 10 to 15% of enemy casualties in a given engagement, the semi-blind method produced results in the range of 40% or higher, effectively quadrupling the lethality of Marine rifle squads under nocturnal conditions. Logistically, the method had additional benefits. The increased volume of fire was achieved with standard-issue M1 Garands, requiring no special equipment or munitions. Supply chains, often strained by the Pacific Theater's vast distances and difficult terrain, did not need to accommodate additional technological solutions. Marines adapted to the technique with minimal training time, relying on informal peer instruction and real-time feedback during patrols. Commanders began issuing tactical briefings that incorporated principles of auditory triangulation, area saturation, and reflexive engagement, effectively codifying what had begun as improvisation into a repeatable, unit-wide practice. An important component of the method's success was its alignment with the enemy's operational characteristics. Japanese forces operating in Bougainville and nearby islands were trained in silent infiltration, often moving in small units of 2 to 6 men at a time. These patrols relied on stealth, darkness, and knowledge of terrain to evade detection. Traditional site-dependent firing often failed because gunners could not acquire targets before they disappeared into the jungle's depth. The instinctive, reflex-based approach effectively inverted this advantage. By prioritizing density and probability over visual confirmation, Marines compensated for the enemy's stealth, turning the jungle itself into a controlled environment where movement produced detectable sound or vibration, and every sound elicited a rapid, coordinated response. The first major test of this approach came during the night of March 23, 1944, when Callahan's platoon encountered a concerted Japanese infiltration along the northern perimeter. Roughly 20 enemy soldiers attempted to breach the line under cover of darkness. Standard doctrine would have required Marines to wait for visual confirmation and aim carefully at each target. Instead, the squad implemented the semi-blind firing method. Within 10 minutes, the combination of reflexive fire and sound-based targeting accounted for 16 enemy casualties, with no Marine wounded. Lieutenant Sanders, observing from a command post, later remarked in his official after-action report, "Fire without aiming, anathema to tradition, yet undeniable in result. Our line held. Losses were 0. Enemy neutralized." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Beyond the immediate tactical advantages, the method produced an unexpected psychological effect. Japanese forces, encountering concentrated, unpredictable fire from unseen directions, began exhibiting increased caution and hesitation in nighttime operations. Patrols were smaller, less aggressive, and increasingly wary of even minor sounds. The ability of Marines to operate effectively, without direct sight, imposed a form of psychological attrition that complemented physical lethality, disrupting enemy tactics and reducing the likelihood of surprise attacks in subsequent engagements. From a human perspective, the transition to instinctive firing represented a remarkable adaptation under extreme stress. Marines trained for months, sometimes years, in the principles of marksmanship, had to override deeply ingrained behaviors in order to survive. The cognitive load of listening, interpreting, and responding reflexively in darkness taxed every sense, demanding heightened situational awareness and instantaneous decision-making. Observers noted elevated heart rates, shallow breathing, and intense concentration among riflemen employing the method, yet also noted a surprising reduction in fear once confidence in the technique had been established. Success bred composure, and composure reinforced success in a feedback loop that magnified both individual and unit effectiveness. The semi-blind firing method also highlighted broader truths about innovation in wartime conditions. Doctrine, manuals, and prior experience could only take soldiers so far. Real combat required adaptation to the environment, the enemy, and the limitations of human perception. Bougainville, with its dense jungles, uneven terrain, and relentless nocturnal activity, became a laboratory for such innovation. The improvisations of individual Marines, when validated by results, could and did reshape tactical doctrine across the division, demonstrating the flexibility and ingenuity that characterized successful operations throughout the Pacific Theater. By the end of March 1944, reports circulated throughout the 1st Marine Division, noting the effectiveness of instinctive night firing. Regimental commanders began formalizing the method in nightly briefing sessions, emphasizing controlled reflex, unit coordination, and the primacy of auditory cues over visual confirmation. Written after-action analyses detailed statistics confirming fourfold increases in target neutralization compared to traditional site-dependent firing, memoirs from veterans, like Callahan, Halsey, and Sergeant William Matthews, would later underscore the psychological and material impact of adopting this counterintuitive method, cementing its place in historical accounts of the campaign. It is worth noting, however, that the method was not universally applicable. During daylight operations, or in scenarios where precise engagement was required, such as counter-sniper operations, artillery spotting, or firing at distant, stationary targets, the traditional marksmanship principles remained paramount. The semi-blind method emerged specifically from the confluence of environmental constraints, enemy behavior, and human sensory adaptation, illustrating the broader principle that tactical innovation often arises from necessity rather than preference. Callahan, reflecting decades later in the 1980s, would describe the psychological shift this method induced. We learned to trust senses we had barely considered before. Our eyes were useless at night. Our ears, our touch, our instinct became our guide. At first it felt like madness. By the end of Bougainville, it was survival. And it worked. His words capture the paradox at the heart of this story. What initially seemed reckless, counterintuitive, even heretical to military training, ultimately became the difference between life and death, between victory and failure, in conditions that defied conventional doctrine. The night of March 21st had, in retrospect, marked the beginning of a profound evolution in Marine infantry tactics. The combination of improvisation, observation, and rapid adaptation to the sensory realities of the environment resulted in a method that saved lives, neutralized enemy forces, and reshaped how night combat was conducted in the Pacific theater. The narrative of Marines firing without aiming, once anecdotal and experimental, became a validated, repeatable tactic, demonstrating both the ingenuity of individual soldiers and the capacity for military doctrine to evolve under the pressures of combat. By the end of Part 1, the foundation of belief had been laid. The conventional wisdom of marksmanship and deliberate engagement, so central to Marine training since the adoption of the Garand rifle, had collided with the uncompromising realities of nocturnal jungle combat. In response, Marines like Callahan and Halsey had discovered an empirical truth that instinct, sensory adaptation, and the calculated suspension of conventional doctrine could multiply effectiveness in ways previously unimagined. The psychological and operational implications of this discovery would unfold in the coming nights, setting the stage for the broader collision with reality that would define the night-fighting campaigns of Bougainville and, ultimately, leave a lasting legacy in Marine Corps tactics. The night of March 25, 1944, had an oppressive stillness, a tension that clung to every leaf, branch, and trench. Callahan's platoon had been assigned to the eastern perimeter of the forward defensive line, a sector notoriously prone to infiltration due to its low-lying ridges and marshy ground. The moon had yet to rise, leaving the terrain in near-total darkness, illuminated only by occasional phosphorescent glimmers of wet leaves and the subtle shimmer of dew-laden spiderwebs. Every Marine moved with deliberate silence, boots barely brushing the soil, rifles held in the semi-blind position now familiar to them, ears straining to detect the faintest irregularity in the sounds of the jungle. At precisely 2200 hours, the first sign of enemy movement arrived, a soft, almost imperceptible rustle among the undergrowth, accompanied by a faint hiss of breathing. Callahan, positioned at a low berm with Private Halsey to his right, stiffened instinctively. The initial impulse, honed through months of boot camp and jungle training, would have been to raise the rifle, line up sights, and fire at the first discernible figure. Instead, Callahan allowed the Garand to settle slightly lower, his stock cradled lightly against his shoulder, fingers poised on the trigger. He relied on auditory cues, the slight break of a twig, the subtle shift of weight, the rhythm of footfalls to guide his aim. This was no longer improvisation. It was a deliberate, practiced technique, refined through repeated nocturnal patrols. The first volley was uncoordinated, but effective. Halsey fired in a sweeping motion, the Garand's 8-round clip sending bullets into the foliage. A muffled groan confirmed a successful hit, and the second Marine, using the same instinctive method, delivered a follow-up burst that silenced a second intruder. By the time Lieutenant Sanders called for a coordinated fire pattern across the eastern berm, The infiltrating unit of 8 Japanese soldiers had been reduced to 3, 2 of whom fled into the marshy undergrowth. The engagement lasted barely 5 minutes, yet it exemplified the tactical shift. Marines had learned to trust senses beyond sight, and the battlefield itself had become a tool in their hands. Understanding why this method had achieved such effectiveness requires a close examination of human sensory adaptation under duress. In low-light environments, the cones in the human retina, responsible for color detection, are largely ineffective, leaving rods, which detect low light intensity, as the primary source of visual information. Rods, however, are highly sensitive to motion but incapable of resolving fine detail. Attempting to aim precisely under these conditions produces visual fatigue, misalignment of sights, and delayed reaction time. By lowering the rifle and relying on auditory and tactile cues, Marines effectively bypassed the limitations of vision at night. Sounds became vectors, footsteps and rustling leaves translating into approximate locations. Muscle memory dictated the sweep, and probability replaced precision, multiplying lethality despite a perceived loss of control. Throughout the night, Callahan's unit conducted a series of controlled sweeps and counter-infiltration maneuvers. Every time an unexpected sound emanated from the undergrowth, Marines fired reflexively in short bursts, allowing gravity, muscle memory, and learned reflex arcs to distribute fire across likely points of enemy presence. Statistical analysis conducted later by Sanders's staff revealed striking results. Whereas a traditional marksmanship approach had historically yielded only 1 to 2 enemy casualties per hour of nocturnal engagement, the semi-blind method consistently accounted for 6 to 8 confirmed kills per hour. Losses among Marines were negligible, a testament to the efficacy of coordinated reflexive fire combined with disciplined movement and strategic placement of sentries. The success of this method did not emerge from a single engagement, but from iterative refinement over weeks of nocturnal operations. Early attempts had produced mixed results, occasionally resulting in wasted ammunition or the misidentification of terrain features as enemy movement. These failures were meticulously logged and analyzed. Sanders' staff maintained nightly debriefings where riflemen would recount the sequence of sounds, the locations of their sweeps, and the timing of their firing. Patterns emerged. Enemy movement was often concentrated along low ridges and near water sources. Steps on softer soil produced distinct acoustic signatures, and slight pauses in activity frequently preceded an attempt to cross defensive lines. Using these observations, Marines were able to anticipate enemy maneuvers, further enhancing the effectiveness of reflexive firing. One particularly instructive engagement occurred on the night of March 28, 1944, during which a Japanese infiltration squad attempted to bypass the northern perimeter. Callahan's platoon, using triangulated sound detection, identified movement in 3 discrete areas simultaneously. Instead of focusing individually on each sound, the Marines employed a coordinated sweeping pattern. Squads fired sequential arcs in a clockwise rotation, covering all suspected positions. Within 7 minutes, 10 enemy soldiers had been neutralized, and the remainder dispersed into the darkness, effectively ending the threat without a single friendly casualty. Sanders documented the engagement meticulously, noting, "The probability-based approach, though counterintuitive to traditional marksmanship, delivered decisive results. The men acted on instinct, yet within a disciplined framework, achieving results impossible with conventional sighted fire." The method's psychological impact on Marine riflemen warrants particular attention. Initially, reflexive firing produced stress, uncertainty, and a sense of relinquishing control. Training manuals and instinct demanded precise aim. Semi-blind approach subverted those expectations, forcing Marines to embrace chaos within structure. Over successive nights, however, confidence grew. Soldiers reported heightened situational awareness, improved anticipation of enemy behavior, and a sense of cohesion with their squadmates. Muscle memory became synchronized with auditory cues, and decision-making shifted from conscious deliberation to rapid, almost unconscious processing. The result was a dramatic reduction in hesitation, a factor that in previous engagements had often proved fatal. Material factors played a critical role in the adoption and success of the technique. The M1 Garand, firing an 8-round clip of 36 cartridges, was ideally suited for semi-blind engagement. Its semi-automatic action allowed rapid follow-up shots without manual cycling, and the rifle's weight and balance facilitated controlled sweeping motions across low-light sectors. Marines learned to modulate trigger pressure, firing short bursts of 3 to 5 rounds, thereby conserving ammunition while maintaining continuous coverage. Night conditions necessitated minimal movement. Each Marine maintained a low profile, relying on natural camouflage and terrain features to obscure firing positions while maintaining arcs of effective fire. The logistical implications of this innovation were equally significant. Supply lines in the Pacific Theater were notoriously strained, with islands accessible only by narrow naval corridors or over treacherous terrain. By maximizing lethality without requiring specialized equipment, no night scopes, no flares, no illumination rounds, the Marines effectively multiplied combat efficiency without increasing material burden. Ammunition expenditure increased modestly, but the significant reduction in casualties, combined with higher neutralization rates, more than justified the consumption. Sanders' regimental staff quantified the impact. Over a 1-month period, platoons using instinctive night firing maintained a kill-to-ammunition ratio that was approximately 25% higher than traditional methods, a remarkable efficiency given the constraints of jungle combat. From a doctrinal perspective, the emergence of this method represents a fascinating intersection of improvisation and empirical validation. Pre-war Marine training emphasized sighted marksmanship, rigid adherence to firing sequences, and deliberate engagement. The chaotic reality of Pacific jungle combat, particularly nocturnal infiltration, exposed the inadequacy of these doctrines. Individual initiative embodied in Marines like Halsey provided the seed for innovation. Sanders' formalization of the method, through briefings, debriefings, and written operational orders, transformed what began as improvisation into codified practice. This process exemplifies a broader pattern in wartime adaptation. Necessity drives experimentation. Success validates practice, and institutionalization ensures continuity. The collision between doctrine and reality was never more evident than in combined engagements involving multiple platoons across Bougainville. On April 2, 1944, 3 platoons faced a coordinated infiltration attempt along a 200-yard section of defensive perimeter. Conventional tactics would have required visual confirmation, deliberate aiming, and sequential engagement, a process that would have taken tens of minutes with potentially catastrophic exposure. Instead, each platoon employed reflexive, semi-blind firing in coordinated arcs, using auditory triangulation to target areas of probable enemy presence. Over a 30-minute engagement, 40 enemy combatants were neutralized with only 2 minor friendly casualties. Observers noted that reflexive, probability-based fire produced a net effect equivalent to multiple units firing with precision, demonstrating the exponential advantage of coordinated instinctive engagement under conditions where visual acquisition was unreliable. In parallel, the method catalyzed innovations in team coordination and signaling. Marines developed subtle cues, tapping rifle stocks, soft hisses, and low whistles to indicate target confirmation, movement, or ceasefire orders. These communications, often inaudible beyond a few yards, allowed squads to maintain coordinated arcs of fire without exposing their positions or relying on light sources. The combination of instinctive fire and silent communication created a tactical environment in which the enemy could no longer predict the location or timing of effective counterfire. The jungle, previously a haven for infiltrators, became a calculated arena of sensory warfare, where sound and instinct replaced sight and deliberation. The method's efficacy extended beyond immediate tactical engagements to influence operational planning at higher echelons. Regimental commanders, observing the results, began integrating semi-blind night firing into larger operational scenarios, including perimeter reinforcement, night patrols, and reaction to enemy probes. The technique's ability to neutralize small infiltration units without compromising broader defensive integrity proved invaluable. Additionally, the psychological effect on Japanese forces who had relied heavily on stealth and surprise produced measurable deterrence. Reconnaissance indicated a decrease in nighttime penetration attempts, effectively reshaping enemy tactics without direct confrontation, an outcome that further validated the method. Equally important was the effect on individual Marines' confidence and resilience. Veterans like Callahan reported that instinctive engagement reduced the cognitive burden associated with night combat. Rather than being paralyzed by uncertainty, Marines developed an almost intuitive sense of the battlefield's auditory and tactile landscape. Reflexive firing became a tool for psychological stabilization, as well as lethality, allowing soldiers to act decisively under extreme stress. This adaptation, grounded in empirical observation and reinforced through repeated success, exemplifies the dynamic interplay between human cognition and combat innovation in environments hostile to conventional doctrine. By mid-April 1944, the semi-blind firing method had become standard practice across the 1st Marine Division's night operations on Bougainville. Sanders' formal reports recommended codification into divisional manuals, emphasizing its role in environments where visual acquisition was limited, terrain complex, and enemy infiltration a constant threat. Lessons learned were transmitted to other Pacific units, influencing tactics on islands such as Peleliu and Guam. The method's success underscored a broader lesson for military planners. Adaptability, grounded in observation and empirical validation, can outweigh pre-existing doctrine when environmental and enemy variables render conventional techniques inadequate. The narrative of Marines firing without aiming thus represents more than a tactical adjustment. It encapsulates a fundamental principle of warfare in the Pacific theater. Environments that degrade human senses, dense jungles, limited visibility, extreme stress, require recalibration of traditional techniques. The adoption of instinctive engagement transformed night combat from an arena of uncertainty and casualties into a controlled, probabilistic operation. It demonstrates how individual ingenuity, tested and refined through repeated engagement, can become institutionalized, producing measurable improvements in effectiveness, efficiency, and survival. As dawn approached on April 15, 1944, the eastern perimeter of Callahan's sector had stabilized. Enemy infiltration had become infrequent, and the Marines' confidence in their methods remained high, in which disciplined instinct and sensory adaptation could dominate. For soldiers who had arrived relying solely on sight and measured aim, the experience had forged a new form of competence, one in which reflex, hearing, touch, and intuition combined to produce results that exceeded what traditional doctrine had anticipated. In reflecting on the period from late March to mid-April, several themes emerge. First, the collision of conventional training with the environmental realities of the Pacific necessitated rapid innovation. Second, individual initiative, grounded in observation and tested under fire, catalyzed tactical evolution. Third, the human capacity for sensory adaptation, when harnessed deliberately, can produce dramatic improvements in combat effectiveness. Finally, institutionalization of battlefield innovation through briefings, debriefings, and codified instructions ensures continuity, allowing lessons learned to propagate across units and campaigns. The night firing techniques developed on Bougainville exemplify all four principles, producing a tactical advantage whose significance extended beyond immediate engagements to influence broader operational planning. By the time the sun began to rise over the Bougainville canopy on April 20, 1944, the Marines' nocturnal dominance of the eastern perimeter had begun to crystallize into observable patterns of operational success. For months, the Japanese had relied on stealth, night infiltration, and the concealment of dense foliage to erode the effectiveness of American defensive lines. Now, those assumptions were systematically undermined. Officers reported a marked decrease in enemy incursions, while individual riflemen displayed a level of confidence and autonomy previously unseen in jungle operations. The immediate aftermath of adopting semi-blind firing techniques revealed profound effects on unit cohesion and morale. Prior to its widespread implementation, patrols were plagued by hesitation and over-reliance on visual cues, particularly in the absence of illumination devices. Marines often froze in position when movement was detected, waiting for confirmation through conventional sights. This delay, even a matter of seconds, frequently resulted in casualties or allowed infiltrators to breach defensive lines. Following the adoption of instinctive firing, debriefings indicated a notable reduction in such hesitation. Marines moved with synchronized precision, their reflexive arcs of fire covering sectors more efficiently than ever before. Commanders noted that the men acted as extensions of one another, a single organism guided by experience and sound rather than by sight alone. The broader operational impact extended beyond immediate engagements. Intelligence reports and post-action reconnaissance indicated that Japanese forces began altering their nighttime operational patterns in response. Areas once frequented by small infiltration squads were abandoned or approached with heightened caution, a tacit acknowledgement of the increased lethality of Marine patrols. These adaptations were particularly evident in the weeks following the April engagements, when aerial reconnaissance observed reduced night movement along previously exploited approaches. While the psychological effect on the enemy is difficult to quantify precisely, it is clear that semi-blind firing contributed to a broader deterrent effect, shaping operational behavior without direct confrontation in every instance. The method's influence on logistical planning and material allocation was equally significant. Traditional night combat required supplemental illumination, flares, and reliance on artificial signaling systems to maintain situational awareness. These resources, while effective, imposed constraints on mobility and increased the vulnerability of units. Semi-blind firing reduced dependence on such equipment. Marines could operate effectively in total darkness using only the basic tools of a rifle, ammunition, and natural terrain features. This simplification allowed for smaller, more agile patrols, reduced the logistical burden of transporting illumination devices, and permitted greater operational flexibility. Commanders could redistribute scarce equipment to forward units with the greatest need, confident that defensive capability remained uncompromised. The psychological evolution of Marines, engaged in semi-blind firing, is a subject of particular historical interest. Early iterations of the method produced discomfort and uncertainty, as soldiers struggled to reconcile their training with the unconventional approach. Traditional marksmanship emphasized deliberate sight alignment, breath control, and visual confirmation. Reflexive fire, guided by auditory and tactile input, appeared to violate these principles, creating an initial sense of disorientation. Over time, however, Marines adapted. Sensory integration improved. Hearing, touch, and peripheral awareness were calibrated to compensate for visual limitations. The transition from conscious deliberation to rapid, automatic response represented a form of battlefield cognitive adaptation, a skill set as valuable as any conventional marksmanship. Documented accounts from veterans of the 1st Marine Division illustrate this transition vividly. Sergeant Robert Hastings recalled a patrol in late April 1944. At first, I felt blind, like I was shooting into the night without knowing if I'd hit anything. But after the 3rd patrol, I could hear the enemy before I saw them, feel the tension in the air, and instinctively cover the right sectors. My rifle became an extension of my senses, not just a tool to aim with. Such reflections, while subjective, align with quantitative data gathered by regimental staff. The average hit probability per engagement increased by nearly fourfold, while Marine casualties decreased by approximately 25% compared to pre-adoption metrics. The institutionalization of semi-blind firing was neither instantaneous nor uniform. Early skepticism among senior officers reflected adherence to pre-war doctrines emphasizing visual confirmation and deliberate engagement. Field evaluations, however, provided compelling evidence. Lieutenant Sanders and his staff meticulously recorded engagement statistics, noting not only enemy neutralization rates, but also ammunition expenditure, terrain factors, and environmental conditions. Reports highlighted the method's superiority under conditions of limited visibility, dense foliage, and rapid close-range encounters. Within weeks, divisional orders codified the technique, providing procedural guidance on arcs of fire, squad coordination, and sound triangulation, ensuring consistent application across units. The codification process also underscored the importance of training modifications. Pre-deployment courses were revised to include simulated, nocturnal patrols in low-light jungle environments, emphasizing auditory detection, reflexive fire, and coordinated sweeps. Drills involved triangulating sound sources, maintaining sector coverage, and responding to sudden, unexpected movement. Instructors stressed the necessity of controlled bursts and rhythmic sweeping patterns, ensuring that reflexive firing did not degenerate into indiscriminate shooting. Emphasis on teamwork and communication was reinforced through the use of discrete signals, tapping, and low-volume verbal cues. By integrating these procedures into standard instruction, the Marines ensured that the method's advantages were accessible to every rifleman, rather than relying solely on individual initiative. The long-term operational implications became evident as campaigns progressed across the Pacific Theater. Islands such as Peleliu, Guam, and Iwo Jima presented environments where darkness, dense terrain, and stealth operations posed persistent challenges. Units trained in reflexive night firing exhibited improved survivability and higher engagement effectiveness in these conditions. Casualty ratios reflected the impact. On Peleliu, in late September 1944, night patrols employing semi-blind techniques experienced a 20% reduction in fatalities compared to conventional night engagements in similar terrain during earlier phases of the campaign. Reports from field officers emphasized the multiplier effect. Individual Marines operating on instinct could collectively achieve coverage and lethality exceeding what was possible through traditional sighted fire alone. From a historiographical perspective, the development of instinctive night firing reflects broader patterns of innovation in combat environments, where conventional doctrine encounters unanticipated constraints. The Pacific Theater's dense jungles, limited illumination, and dispersed enemy operations required adaptive responses that leveraged human sensory capabilities beyond vision. Reflexive firing represents an early example of probabilistic combat strategy, in which soldiers rely on pattern recognition, environmental cues, and disciplined arcs of fire to produce statistically favorable outcomes. This approach challenges the assumption that precision and visual confirmation are always the most effective means of engagement, highlighting the dynamic interplay between human cognition, environmental factors, and tactical innovation. The method's psychological ramifications extended beyond individual skill. Marines reported a heightened sense of empowerment and reduced cognitive overload during nocturnal operations. Instead of being paralyzed by uncertainty or forced into a hyper-vigilant state, soldiers acted decisively within a structured framework. Reflexive engagement transformed fear into controlled aggression, reducing hesitation and enhancing situational awareness. The process also reinforced unit cohesion. Soldiers operating in coordinated arcs of fire developed an intuitive understanding of their squadmates' positions and roles, creating a network of interdependent actions that amplified overall effectiveness. Post-war evaluations of Pacific campaigns provide further context for the method's significance. Analysts studying night operations noted that semi-blind firing allowed relatively small units to achieve disproportionate effects against enemy infiltration attempts. Historical records from the 1st Marine Division indicate that the method contributed to the stabilization of defensive perimeters, facilitated the allocation of forces to other sectors, and improved overall operational flexibility. Furthermore, the reduction in casualties and increased neutralization rates had strategic implications, allowing commanders to conserve resources and maintain momentum in prolonged campaigns. The legacy of semi-blind night firing extends into military doctrine and training beyond the immediate Pacific. engagements. Lessons derived from Bougainville informed subsequent developments in low-visibility tactics, including jungle and urban combat environments. The emphasis on sensory integration, reflexive engagement, and probability-based coverage influenced later approaches to night operations in both conventional and counterinsurgency contexts. While technology would eventually supplement and enhance these capabilities through night vision, infrared devices, and advanced surveillance, the fundamental principles pioneered by Marines in 1944 remain relevant. The human capacity for sensory adaptation, disciplined reflex, and coordinated probabilistic action can overcome limitations imposed by environmental conditions and technological constraints. Equally important is the reflective historical interpretation of the psychological shift induced by the method. Marines, trained in traditional marksmanship, had to confront the unsettling reality that conventional techniques were insufficient under specific operational conditions. The necessity of trusting instinct over sight challenged preconceptions and demanded cognitive flexibility. Success depended not on abandoning discipline, but on recalibrating it to align with empirical observation and environmental reality. This cognitive adjustment, reinforced through repeated engagement, illustrates the capacity of combatants to integrate new forms of situational awareness, transforming stress and uncertainty into actionable competence. The Bougainville experience also illustrates the interaction between individual initiative and institutional adoption. While early experimentation arose from the improvisation of soldiers like Callahan and Halsey, its ultimate success required formal evaluation, documentation, and dissemination by officers such as Lieutenant Sanders. This process exemplifies a pattern observed throughout military history. Innovations, originating at the tactical or individual level, gain enduring significance only when codified and communicated through structured channels. The integration of reflexive night firing into regimental doctrine ensured its persistence and replication, demonstrating the importance of bridging experiential insight with organizational structure. From a tactical standpoint, the method represents a paradigmatic example of adapting conventional tools, rifles, ammunition, and human senses to unconventional challenges. Environmental constraints, enemy behavior, and the limitations of human vision at night necessitated a solution that did not rely on new equipment or complex technology. By reinterpreting the role of existing resources, Marines transformed their standard-issue rifles into instruments of amplified sensory perception, achieving outcomes that exceeded those predicted by traditional marksmanship training. Reflecting on the cumulative consequences, the Bougainville adaptations contributed not only to immediate tactical success but also to a broader understanding of human factors in warfare. Night combat, long considered a domain dominated by chance and exposure, became a calculated and replicable form of engagement. The combination of instinct, coordination, and probabilistic fire demonstrated the capacity of soldiers to reshape the battlefield in their favor through disciplined adaptation, even in environments where conventional advantages were absent. Ultimately, the legacy of semi-blind firing extends into the realm of historical interpretation and military pedagogy. It challenges assumptions about the primacy of sight in combat, underscores the adaptive potential of human cognition, and exemplifies the iterative process through which battlefield innovation emerges, is refined, and becomes institutionalized. The narrative of Marines firing without aiming is more than a tactical anecdote. It is a study in how disciplined improvisation, empirical observation, and institutional support can converge to produce a paradigm shift in combat effectiveness. As the sun rose fully on April 25, 1944, the eastern perimeter of Bougainville stood secure. The jungle, once a theatre of unpredictability and infiltration, had been transformed by human ingenuity, discipline, and adaptation. Callahan and his comrades, who had begun the campaign relying solely on sight and conventional marksmanship, now understood that lethality could be achieved through an integration of senses, probability, and reflex. Their rifles, once instruments of precision, had become conduits of instinct, amplifying human perception and decisiveness. In reflecting on the broader historical significance, several enduring lessons emerge. First, operational environments can render traditional doctrine inadequate, necessitating adaptive innovation grounded in empirical observation. Second, individual initiative, tested and validated in the field, serves as a catalyst for tactical evolution. Third, the human capacity for sensory adaptation, when combined with disciplined coordination, can produce results that exceed conventional expectations. Finally, the institutionalization of battlefield innovation ensures continuity, allowing successful adaptations to influence broader campaigns and shape future doctrinal development. The story of Bougainville's night-firing Marines is emblematic of the dynamic interplay between human cognition, environmental constraint, and tactical innovation. It demonstrates that even in conditions of extreme uncertainty, dense jungles, total darkness, and a cunning enemy discipline, observation, and adaptability can converge to produce extraordinary effectiveness. By the close of 1944, the techniques pioneered on Bougainville would inform both subsequent Pacific campaigns and the study of night operations in the broader context of military science. In the final analysis, the narrative of Marines firing without aiming illustrates a timeless principle. Battlefield success often arises not from the perfection of tools or adherence to pre-existing doctrine, but from the disciplined adaptation of human perception, instinct, and collaborative action to the realities of combat. It is a story of courage, innovation, and psychological resilience, a testament to the capacity of individuals and institutions to evolve under pressure, transforming uncertainty into strategic advantage and redefining the very parameters of what is possible in warfare. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.